Hello everyone, my name is Arizona Woodard and I will be covering the topic of legalization of marijuana. The two articles for this critique are titled Marijuana Use and Related Healthcare Encounters in Colorado Before and After Retail Legalization from 2018 and the Impact of Marijuana Legalization on Law Enforcement in States Surrounding Colorado from 2019. First article focused on the research questions of how did the legalization of marijuana in Colorado impact rates of marijuana usage and whether there was a statistical increase in adverse health events after the legalization of marijuana in Colorado. And those adverse health events were caused to poison centers or hospitalizations due to some type of marijuana use or exposure. And the setup for this study was essentially just a research analysis for data that had already been collected in Colorado. The researchers weren't going out and finding new data. They surveyed data from pre and post legalization, and their sources of data were primarily from population-based surveys, poison center data, and hospital discharge data. There were several categories that the researchers chose to organize the findings related to marijuana usage and adverse health encounters, and they were separated by age. It included fetuses/babies, which was focused on prenatal exposure. This included if the mother had used marijuana while pregnant or if she used it while breastfeeding the child, and the category of young children, and then older children/adolescents, and young adults. The significant findings from this article included some overarching conclusions, such as the legalization of marijuana did not really have any kind of impact on the rates of marijuana usage. Those pretty much remained stable even after legalization, but there was an increase in healthcare encounters that mentioned marijuana. Also, while the usage rate of marijuana for young adults has pretty much been stable even after legalization in Colorado, this demographic had the highest usage rate and also had the most amount of individuals that were considered daily users. The article also included more detailed findings for each age group. For example, in regard to prenatal exposure, the researchers concluded that about 6% of pregnant women in Colorado use marijuana during pregnancy or in the process of breastfeeding. Additionally, young children with age from 1 to 14 years old, about 2% of those live in homes where marijuana is not stored safely. This could lead to a child accidentally or intentionally getting a hold of marijuana and ingesting it, which might lead to a poison center call or a hospitalization. And while the researchers note that poison center calls and hospitalizations are generally pretty rare for children 0 to 8 years old, those rates actually did increase after the legalization of marijuana. And for the category of older children and adolescents, there was a pretty significant and noticeable increase in the number of marijuana-related poison center calls for children aged 9 to 17 years old. But the increase of hospitalizations with the marijuana code for that age group was moderate. It really wasn't that much of a noticeable difference. But overall, marijuana usage for adolescents remained stable post-legalization. And the research category, young adults, actually was pretty interesting. Because those individuals 18 to 25 years old kind of had a reversed outcome as to older children and adolescents. So while there was only a slight increase in poison center calls due to marijuana use, the amount of hospitalizations that had a marijuana code or mention tripled post-legalization of marijuana. The second article, The Impact of Marijuana Legalization on Law Enforcement in States Surrounding Colorado, had three main research questions it was trying to address. The first one being, how has legalization of recreational marijuana in Colorado affected law enforcement duties in neighboring states? And do officers differ in their perceptions of favorability of marijuana legalization or the perceived impact Colorado's legalization had on their jobs based on the state from which they work and their proximity to Colorado? And the last one being, what factors impact officers' perceptions of the impact marijuana legalization in Colorado has had on enforcement in their area? This was considered an exploratory study because it was addressing a topic within legalization that had not really been looked into before. Also using the survey method, and it was a multi-stage cluster sampling for different municipal police department and sheriff offices in 3 neighboring states. Surveys were sent in either packages or through email, and it had 97 sheriff's departments and 129 municipal police departments within the sample. Data collection for this study took place between June and September of 2017. The research categories for this study included the neighboring states of Kansas, Nebraska, and Wyoming. Each of those states was broken into 3 clusters where officers were selected at random for the survey. And the whole goal for each cluster was that each one should be kind of an equal distance away from the border of Colorado, so that researchers could kind of get an idea if the distance away from the border affected the enforcement and perceptions of the officers more in those areas. I decided to include these charts from the article because they show the very specific topics addressed by the survey, such as whether the officers felt that there was an increase in concern of marijuana-related crimes for citizens. And for each of these categories, the chart gives the numerical data for how many officers responded with strongly disagree, neutral, agree, or strongly agree. I'm not going to go through each of these, but if anyone wants to pause the video and take a closer look for each of those topics, that might be a more informative way to see exactly what this study was about and the specific topics that the officers were asked. And the same thing goes for this slide. The only difference is that these survey topics look at the personal perception of the officer, such as whether or not they agree that marijuana is considered a gateway drug. And similarly to the first article, this study had some overall major conclusions to address, such as that the officers surveyed felt that Colorado's legalization had the consequence of negatively impacting their enforcement duties for their respective states. Specifically, the major issues officers felt occurred after the legalization were that this policy change actually increased the potency of marijuana that they were seeing, the perceived juvenile use of marijuana in their states, and the overall strain that they were experiencing on their resources from having to deal with the unintended consequences from marijuana legalization. Even though it was in Colorado, it was still affecting what was going on in their states. Further analysis of the research also showed that the officers from departments and counties farther away from the Colorado state line showed an overall lower perception of impact of legalization as compared to those counties that were closer to the Colorado border. And I think this finding shows the significance of breaking down the different states by their clusters, because each cluster was a farther distance away from the border, and then there actually in turn was a research finding showing that that did have an effect on the perception. So it was good that the researchers broke up the states in that way. Additionally, Wyoming was the state that showed the largest and most statistically noticeable impact of the officer perceptions on enforcement of their duties. However, the researchers found that that finding was actually not really statistically significant, because when they controlled for the officers' personal perceptions, which if you remember, that was the second portion of the survey, that those perceptions balanced out why people in Wyoming felt that the marijuana legalization had more impact on them. They already had different preconceived notions of marijuana that may have been biased to that finding. In conclusion, I'm going to compare both of the articles. I think that they were similar in that they were both interested in the effects of Colorado's legalization of recreational marijuana, that policy change, and kind of how it affected certain individuals and even society as a whole. And then they both included data from surveys. They were also both published recently, I think from 2018 and 2019, which makes both of the findings of the research pretty relevant. And they both expressed a need for future research evaluations on marijuana legalization in the article. Nonetheless, these articles certainly had their own different and unique elements from each other. For example, while the first article had data from surveys and organizations' records, such as the hospitalization data, the second article only included data from surveys. And the first article focused primarily on marijuana legalization effects regarding both usage and health. The goal of the second article was pretty different from that, as it focused on marijuana legalization effects on law enforcement officers. And to make it even more different, the second article had actually no data whatsoever from Colorado, just from those three neighboring states. But the first article was exclusively looking at data in Colorado. Additionally, the Article 1 had research broken down by age categories, whereas research in the second article was broken down between the state clusters from Kansas, Nebraska, and Wyoming. Additionally, the first article only used pre-existing data for a statistical analysis, while the second article included new data that had been collected by the researchers all on their own. Lastly, the most significant difference was that the second article was much more extensive than the first. It actually included a literature review as well as a data analysis, and the geographic clusters were clearly defined, and it also had a detailed list of the survey questions, so you knew exactly what the officers were being asked. However, the first article was more simple, and it never really mentioned the exact questions that were included on any of the surveys used in the data. And the first article also lacked a clear age range for each research category, which made the findings a bit more unclear. But despite that, both articles were very informative regarding the impact of Colorado's recreational marijuana legalization. And here are my references for each article. Thank you for listening.